The day my daughter Emily got married in Napa Valley was supposed to be the proudest day of my life. The sky stretched blue and endless over acres of young green vines, sunlight warming every table set with fine white linen, flutes of champagne catching the light like little prisms. The whole thing looked like something off the cover of a magazine. Not the kind of world a retired mechanic like me, Frank, ever thought I'd find myself in. I wore my best suit, the same one I'd bought when Emily graduated college, though the sleeves felt tighter than I remembered and the knees tugged every time I bent down. My old Ford truck looked almost embarrassed among the rented Teslas and black Mercedes in the parking lot. A little out of place, a little too honest. From the moment I stepped onto the flagstone terrace, I knew this wasn't my world. The music, the polite laughter, the air filled with talk of IPOs and Silicon Valley deals. Everything sparkled in a way that felt cold. Emily spotted me from across the garden, her face lighting up, and for a heartbeat I saw my little girl again. The one who used to tug my hand so hard I thought she'd pull my arm off, begging me to watch her jump into the pool for the 100th time. She ran to me, hugged me so tight I almost forgot about all the fancy cars and sharp suits. For that moment, it felt like it was just the two of us, like nothing could touch the bond we'd built over years of sacrifice and Sunday pancakes, camping trips along the Feather River, and quiet nights just the two of us in Sacramento watching baseball with the window open and the world small and simple outside. But things changed when I met her fiancé's family. Tyler was all crisp lines and perfect hair, his handshake limp and his eyes barely meeting mine before darting away to the next conversation. His mother, and air kissed me on both cheeks, her perfume so thick it made my eyes water. Tyler's father, Richard, arrived late, glancing at his phone as he greeted the other guests with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime moving among the powerful. They were a different breed, high-gloss, high-powered, the kind of people who spoke of legacy like it was a stock option. During the ceremony, I stood by myself near the back, my hands in my pockets, feeling the weight of 1,000 invisible judgments. The vows were beautiful, but I couldn't stop thinking of the years I'd spent saving for Emily's future. The late nights fixing cars so she'd have options I never did. My wife Jane had passed away when Emily was 10, and I'd promised her I'd give our daughter everything. As I watched Emily slip the ring onto Tyler's finger, I remembered all the little promises. A home, an education, a chance at real happiness. But now, looking at the sea of strangers in tailored suits, I felt the line between giving and losing start to blur. The cocktail hour passed in a haze of polite smiles and questions I didn't know how to answer. I clung to the little details, the scent of lemon on the breeze, the feel of my wedding ring on its chain around my neck, the faint ache in my knees from standing too long. I found myself near the edge of the terrace, watching the sun slip lower over the vineyard, wishing Jane could see Emily now, radiant in lace, her mother's eyes shining in her face. Dinner was called just as the sky started to fade from gold to a pale blue. Place cards guided me to a table at the far end of the reception, tucked beside a potted olive tree and out of the way of the main party. I recognized a couple of Emily's college friends, their laughter forced and awkward, unsure how to include me in their conversations about venture capital and destination weddings. I kept my eyes on my plate, swirling the wine, trying not to count the number of forks by my napkin. Then came the moment I'll never forget. I'd stood to shake the hand of a distant relative, a gesture of habit more than hope. As I went to sit back down, Tyler appeared at my side, all smiles for the crowd, his voice loud enough to carry. He reached behind me, and in a movement so practiced it looked like a joke, pulled my chair away just as my weight shifted. My knees buckled and I crashed down hard, the sound of my body hitting the stone echoing louder than the band's saxophone. For a second, time froze. The laughter that followed wasn't kind. It was sharp, amused, and cruel in the way only expensive people can be. I felt the blood rush to my cheeks, the world tilting as faces turned toward me. Not with concern, but with the glee of a crowd at a circus. "Your place is down there, Frank," Tyler said, not even trying to hide his smirk. For an instant, my mind blanked, and I tasted metal, panic, humiliation, the hot sting of being nothing more than an afterthought in my own daughter's life. Emily gasped, pushing through the crowd, tears springing to her eyes. I tried to wave her off, tried to stand with what dignity I had left, but my hands were shaking and my knees screamed in protest. Someone snickered. A woman in pearls whispered to her husband. The servers paused mid-step, eyes wide. I saw Tyler's mother watching, her face a mask of polite horror, one hand fluttering uselessly at her throat. For a second, I thought I might disappear entirely, swallowed by the stone beneath my feet and the shame curling in my gut. But then, just as I steadied myself and tried to gather what scraps of pride I could, a deep voice cut through the shocked silence. Frank. Frank Delaney. I turned, blinking in the half-light, and saw Richard, the groom's father, standing stock-still at the edge of the reception, his face ashen, eyes wide with something that looked a lot like fear. It was as if time folded in on itself. For a heartbeat, I saw a different man. Not the power broker in a navy suit, but a younger Richard, his jaw clenched, a thin scar on his cheek I'd only ever seen in old photographs. He took a step forward, his voice cracking. "Is it really you?" Every head turned. The laughter died in a heartbeat. I heard the clink of glass as someone set down a wine flute. Richard looked at me like he'd seen a ghost. And in that instant, the entire wedding seemed to hold its breath. I had no idea what he was about to say, but the look in his eyes told me whatever happened next would change everything. Not just for me, but for Emily, for Tyler, for every person at that party who thought they knew who I was. The air vibrated with the promise of revelation, something buried for decades about to claw its way into the light. My knees ached, my pride stung, but somewhere deep down, I felt the first shiver of possibility. Maybe, just maybe, my story wasn't finished yet. As the echo of Richard's words hung heavy over the party, my mind retreated, folding back into memories that felt more real than the glint of champagne glasses or the cool marble beneath my feet. For a moment, I wasn't at my daughter's wedding in Napa. I was back in a different place, a world of sweat and dirt and tire iron, and the battered little house in Sacramento that I'd called home for almost 40 years. After Jane died, Emily and I had learned to make a life out of pieces. I remember the first winter without her, how the kitchen felt too big, every corner echoing with her laughter, every closet still smelling faintly of her perfume. I would come home after double shifts at the garage, hands black with oil, and Emily would be waiting on the faded plaid couch, feet tucked under her, pretending to do homework but mostly just watching the front door. We lived on frozen dinners and boxed mac and cheese, our world held together by routine and the stories we made up to distract ourselves from the weight of grief. But I tried my best to keep her whole, to never let the world feel too cold. On Saturdays, we'd load up the old truck with rods and tackle and drive up Highway 49, winding along the Feather River, looking for a quiet patch of water where we could fish, talk about nothing, and let time slow down. Sometimes she'd fall asleep against my shoulder on the way home, the sun painting gold streaks across her face. I'd carry her inside, careful not to wake her, and wonder how something so small and fragile could ever survive what life had thrown at us. Work was my anchor. I fixed cars, old tractors, anything with an engine. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and I could look at my hands at the end of the day and know I'd earned every blister. The garage was where I felt most myself, the familiar smell of grease, the steady rhythm of ratchets and wrenches. The radio always tuned to baseball, Vin Scully calling games like a friend who'd never leave. My coworkers called me the old man, but it was said with respect. They knew what I'd done, or at least what they'd guessed. Bits and pieces of a life before Sacramento, stories they'd never quite fit together. But Emily was the reason I kept going. Every time a bill came due, every time I sat through another school play or parent-teacher night, I thought of Jane and the promise I'd made her. I'd put Emily through college, no matter what it took, even if it meant selling my Harley or pawning the last of Jane's jewelry. When Emily walked across that stage at UC Davis, her cap and gown shining blue in the California sun, I felt like I was floating, untethered by any weight the world could throw at me. Even then, though, I could feel the world shifting beneath my feet. As Emily's dreams got bigger, so did the distance between us. She got a job in the city, first in marketing, then some high-end consulting firm I never quite understood. She moved into an apartment that cost more than my whole house, started bringing home friends with names like Carter and Madison, people who wore smartwatches and talked about equity and lifestyle branding. I tried to keep up, learning new words, pretending not to notice when her friends looked around our house with polite confusion, unsure what to make of the crocheted blankets and old family photos. The last few years, it felt like I was watching Emily drift further away, pulled by a tide I couldn't fight. She stopped coming home as often. Her calls got shorter, more rushed. I'd ask about her job and get a quick summary about a big client or a new product launch. She'd ask about my back, my health, the house, as if ticking boxes on a checklist. I understood, or tried to. She was building something for herself, making a life out of possibilities I'd never even dreamed of. But it stung, knowing that the things I valued, the simple routines, the quiet comfort of shared meals, felt smaller and smaller in her world. Still, when she called me to tell me about Tyler, I heard something in her voice I hadn't heard in years. Hope, a kind of trembling joy. She sent me pictures of the two of them in Lake Tahoe, her eyes bright, his arm slung around her shoulder. I squinted at the photos, looking for clues, for some sign that this man was worthy of her. Tyler looked the part. Tall, well-dressed, a little too polished. But when I met him for the first time, shaking his hand at a brunch spot in San Francisco, I felt a cold emptiness behind his smile. He complimented my truck, then asked if I'd ever considered upgrading. He talked about travel, investments, houses in Malibu, as if money was just a game. Still, Emily glowed when she looked at him, and I told myself that mattered more than anything else. Parents aren't supposed to live their children's lives, only try to keep them safe as long as they can. Jane would have told me to be patient, to let Emily find her own way. But some nights, lying awake in the little house, I worried about what I might be missing. The wedding plans took on a life of their own. Emily invited me to come suit shopping, to sample cakes, to tour venues. I pretended to enjoy the process, though the prices made my head spin and I struggled not to show it. I watched her in those moments, her excitement, her attention to detail, the way she turned to Tyler for approval on every decision, and felt both pride and a quiet sense of loss. The night before the wedding, I sat alone in my living room, the TV flickering in the dark, looking at old photo albums. There was one picture. Emily at 5, riding piggyback on my shoulders at the county fair, her arms thrown wide, her laughter caught forever in a flash of light. Next to it, a faded photo of Jane and me on our wedding day, both of us young and exhausted. My hair still dark, Jane's eyes soft with the promise of forever. I pressed my fingers to the glass, whispering a promise to Jane that I'd watch over Emily, no matter what. Now, here in the vineyard's golden light, I felt the weight of all those years pressing on me. 1,000 invisible threads binding me to my daughter, to the life we'd built from nothing. I watched as Emily moved among her new family, laughing at jokes I didn't understand, her hand resting lightly on Tyler's arm. She looked happy, but there was something else. A tightness around her eyes, a carefulness to her movements, as if she were always just a step behind everyone else, trying to keep up. When I finally found a moment alone with her before the ceremony, I tried to say something that mattered. I wanted to tell her how proud I was, how much I loved her, how none of this fancy world could ever change what we meant to each other. But the words stuck in my throat, tangled with old regrets and fears I couldn't name. Emily squeezed my hand, smiling that brave, shaky smile, and I let her go, trusting she'd find her own way back if she ever got lost. I returned to my table, fighting a growing sense of unease. The laughter around me felt forced now, brittle. I watched Tyler as he moved from group to group, always at the center of attention, always performing. I wondered if anyone else noticed the way he looked through people, the way he measured every interaction. Something about him set my teeth on edge, a feeling I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. Just before dinner, as the sun dipped below the hills and the first stars began to prick the sky, I stepped away from the party, walking along the rows of vines until the noise faded to a distant hum. I needed a moment to breathe, to gather myself for whatever came next. In the stillness, I thought about the day Richard and I met for the first time, decades ago, in a world neither of us had expected to survive. We'd both been young, scared, fighting for our lives in the dust and heat of Iraq. I remembered the sound of gunfire, the taste of sand, the smell of fear so thick you could almost drown in it. There was a night, one I'd never spoken of, not even to Jane, when Richard and I were pinned down, wounded and alone, with no one coming. I'd carried him on my back across 200 yards of open ground, bullets snapping past, every step a prayer. I never expected to see him again, but I did. Just not like this. Now, seeing him at the wedding, calling my name in that stunned, disbelieving voice, I felt something old and unresolved stirring inside me. I realized, with a jolt, that there were secrets even Emily didn't know. Pieces of my life I'd hidden away to keep her safe. But secrets have a way of demanding their own reckoning. Back at the table, I stared down at my hands, scarred, calloused, marked by years of work and sacrifice. I wondered what Emily saw when she looked at me now. Did she see the man who fixed her bikes and carried her through storms? Or just an old relic, a reminder of a life she was desperate to outgrow? I wanted to believe that the threads that bound us were stronger than the distance between our worlds. But doubt crept in like a draft under a closed door. Richard's voice echoed in my mind, and for the first time in years, I felt the past and present collide. A fault line running right through the heart of that perfect California evening. Something was coming, I could feel it. A reckoning, a revelation, a moment that would force all of us to choose what kind of family we wanted to be. I squared my shoulders, took a breath that tasted of earth and memory, and prepared to meet it, whatever it turned out to be. The silence after Richard called my name was almost physical, pressing in on every nerve and sense, making my skin prickle. All eyes followed the line of his outstretched hand, the air sharp with anticipation, as if everyone realized something was about to happen, but no one could guess what. For a heartbeat, even the music paused, leaving only the nervous shuffling of feet and the quickening thud of my own heart. Richard's face was pale beneath the evening lights, a man stunned, wrestling with a memory he'd probably locked away for decades. The lines around his eyes deepened as he stared, and I saw a flicker, something beyond recognition, something closer to gratitude and grief, a mingling of emotions that had no place at a wedding but refused to be hidden. He took a step forward, his expensive shoes barely making a sound on the flagstone, and suddenly the years fell away. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than I remembered, softer, but carried the weight of command that came from surviving the unimaginable. "Frank Delaney," he said again, his tone making it clear this wasn't just a greeting. "It's really you." Guests glanced at each other, confused and hungry for gossip. Tyler looked annoyed, a twitch at his jaw betraying more irritation than concern. And his mother looked between Richard and me, her painted smile flickering uncertainly. Emily, caught between her new family and the one she'd always known, seemed frozen, her hand hovering halfway between reaching for me and folding into herself. Richard drew a deep breath, and the room seemed to lean closer, waiting for a secret to spill. His voice trembled just a little, and his gaze never left my face. "I don't expect anyone here to know this, but Frank saved my life a long time ago. Back in Fallujah, Iraq, 2004. A ripple went through the guests, some whispering, others blinking as if they'd misheard. Richard continued, his words steadying as he reached for a story that had become legend in his own family but had always been more ghost than fact. "There was an ambush. We were trapped. I'd taken shrapnel, couldn't move my leg, and the fighting was closing in. Most people would have stayed behind cover, waited for backup, prayed someone else would be crazy enough to try a rescue. Frank was the only one who came." As he spoke, images rose in my mind, hot wind, grit in my teeth, the stink of sweat and fear, the moment when instinct outweighed common sense and I threw Richard over my shoulder, running across open ground with bullets stitching the sand behind us. The memory was sharper than I wanted it to be, and I felt it all over again. The ache of muscles, the terror, the wild pulse of hope. Richard's voice thickened. He carried me 2 football fields under fire. I would have bled out in the sand if it wasn't for him. I got home. I built this life. I watched my son grow up. And it was all because of Frank Delaney. The man you saw fall tonight is the only reason I'm standing here now. You could have heard a pin drop. A few people gasped. Tyler's face drained of color, his composure cracking, the arrogance dissolving in a rush of confusion and panic. For a long, surreal moment, I wished the ground would open up and swallow me whole. All those years of keeping my head down, never telling anyone, least of all Emily, what I'd done or what it had cost me. I'd left that part of myself on the battlefield, thinking I could build a new life with Jane and my daughter, never needing the world's applause or even its understanding. But now, my entire history was laid bare in front of strangers. Emily's face shimmered through tears. Her lips parted, her expression shifting from shock to something deeper. Recognition, pride, and pain all tangled together, and looked away, her hand trembling as she pressed it to her chest. Richard turned to face the crowd, the power of his position mingling with the raw honesty of a soldier who owed a debt that could never truly be paid. So when I see my son, his voice broke, and he swallowed hard, struggling for control. When I see my son disrespect this man, I feel ashamed. This is not how we treat people. Not in my house, not in my family. It was the kind of speech that changed things. I felt the weight of judgment shift from me onto Tyler, the sense of who belonged and who was out of place flipping in an instant. People looked at me differently now. No longer the awkward, out-of-place mechanic, but someone mysterious, someone whose story was far larger than the suit he wore or the car he drove. And Tyler, who'd spent the day performing confidence and command, looked suddenly very young, very alone, with nowhere to hide. Richard faced me fully, his eyes red with memory. "Frank, I never thanked you, not properly. You never let me. But you deserve every honor, every word, and every ounce of respect this family can give." His hand reached for mine, and when I shook it, it wasn't just a gesture between old soldiers. It was an offering, a peace treaty, a promise that whatever came next, I wouldn't face it alone. Tyler's voice came out thin, brittle. "Dad, I didn't know." But Richard cut him off, quietly, firmly, with all the authority of a father and a man who'd seen what real courage meant. "You didn't care to know, Tyler. That's the difference. Character isn't something you inherit. It's something you earn." Emily took a step toward me, her eyes fixed on my face. I saw her childhood flash in her gaze. The scraped knees, the nights spent curled against my side during thunderstorms, the 1,000 quiet sacrifices that had led us to this very moment. She reached for my hand, holding it tight, and for the first time all day, I felt the bond between us glow with a new kind of strength. No one could take that away, not even time, not even all the money and status in the world. And broke the silence, her voice brittle. "Why didn't you ever tell us, Frank?" I met her eyes, gentler than I felt. "It wasn't my story to tell. I did what anyone would do." The words tasted strange, even as I said them. In truth, I'd spent years trying to believe it, that I wasn't special, that anyone would have done the same. But looking at Tyler, at all the guests who now watched him not with admiration but with suspicion, I knew that wasn't always true. A few guests tried to change the subject, clinking glasses, but the mood had shifted. The people at my table, who'd barely spoken to me earlier, now sat up straighter, their faces open with a mix of curiosity and shame. I could feel the tension in the air, a mixture of admiration and guilt, of old wounds exposed in the sunlight of a California evening. Tyler moved away from the table, his steps uncertain, his shoulders hunched. For the first time since I'd met him, I saw the boy behind the bravado, the cracks in the armor he'd spent a lifetime building. He looked at me and I saw a plea for forgiveness, but also for understanding, as if he wanted to be seen, truly seen, not as his father's son, not as Emily's husband, but as himself. Richard's words rang in my ears. I wondered what it would cost Tyler to change, if he was capable of it. I remembered what it felt like to be young and terrified, to be handed responsibility you weren't ready for, to want desperately to be someone your father could be proud of. For the first time, I pitied him. Emily stood beside me, her head held high, her eyes shining with tears. She squeezed my hand again, grounding me, giving me strength I hadn't realized I'd needed. We were surrounded by people, but In that moment, it felt like it was just us. Father and daughter, bound by love, standing in the center of a storm neither of us had chosen. As the evening stretched on, the story spread. People whispered, glancing my way, their voices hushed with awe and uncertainty. Someone asked if I had any medals. Another wanted to know what Fallujah had really been like. I gave them simple answers, unwilling to relive the worst of it. But I saw in their eyes the slow dawn of respect. For the first time, maybe ever, I felt seen. Richard joined me on the edge of the terrace, his hand warm on my shoulder. He apologized again, this time just for me, his voice full of regret and hope. He asked if we could find a way to mend the break Tyler had created. I said nothing at first, watching the moon rise over the vineyard, the world soft and full of shadows. Eventually, I told him that healing was a journey, not a moment, and that Tyler had to walk it himself. By the time dessert arrived, the mood had shifted. The laughter was quieter now, tinged with something more honest. Emily never left my side, and for once, I let myself lean into her strength, trusting that together, we could weather whatever storm was coming. Tyler avoided my gaze, circling the edge of the crowd like a lost child. As the night wound down, I wondered if this was the moment when the past and present could finally be reconciled, when old debts could be paid and new beginnings forged. I watched my daughter dance under the lights, her dress swirling, her smile uncertain but real. I thought of Jane, of the promises I'd made and the sacrifices I'd kept, and for the first time in years, I felt the fragile, stubborn hope that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. After the secrets of the past and the humiliation of the present finally collided, the wedding crowd seemed to orbit around a new axis. It wasn't the music or the glow of expensive lights or even Emily in her dress that held everyone's attention anymore, but the tremor that ran through the center of the evening. The fracture, still raw and bleeding, between what we pretend and what we are. I could feel eyes on me, their scrutiny both curious and apologetic, but I didn't let myself shrink beneath it. Something inside had changed. Maybe it was the way Emily pressed close to my side or the quiet, determined way Richard stood nearby, not as a rich man hosting a party but as someone bearing witness. Tyler hovered at the edges of the terrace, shoulders hunched, one hand stuffed in his pocket and the other gripping a glass so tight I thought it might shatter. There was no sign of the man who'd worn his confidence like an expensive jacket. Now he looked years younger, stripped of his arrogance. A son caught between the shadow of his father and the glare of his own mistakes. Emily's eyes followed him, torn and pleading, as if hoping he might find the words to fix what he'd broken. But the silence stretched on, thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the soft scrape of silverware and the distant sound of laughter from guests determined to enjoy themselves, or at least pretend they could. I sat at the table, hands folded, letting the weight of the moment settle, resisting the urge to stand and leave, to disappear back into the quiet safety of my old life. But I knew running would only chase me in circles. There comes a point when a man has to face the storm, no matter how unprepared he feels. It was Richard who moved first, standing with a glass in hand and tapping a spoon against it until the attention of the room bent toward him. He didn't raise his voice, but it carried, the kind of authority that can't be bought, only earned in the long, silent years after the shooting stops. He spoke of sacrifice, of the true meaning of honor, of debts that last a lifetime. He called me his brother, his family, not because of blood, but because of what we had shared in that faraway hell. He looked at Tyler, then at the crowd, and said that a man reveals himself not in triumph but in the moment when all his armor is stripped away, that the only way forward was truth. I felt everyone looking at Tyler, the pressure rising, the unspoken demand for him to do what was right. He shifted, his mouth working, but no sound came. For a moment, I almost pitied him, the fear, the embarrassment, the desire to crawl out of his own skin and start over as someone else. But then I remembered the cold smile, the pulled chair, the words that stung like a slap in front of my own daughter and the world. The path to redemption always starts with humility. Finally, Tyler stood, slow and uncertain, moving toward the center of the terrace where everyone could see him. His hands shook. He tried for a joke, something to ease the tension, but the words withered in the air, falling flat. Instead, he looked at Emily, really looked at her, as if seeing the cost of his actions written across her face for the first time. Her pain, her love, her disappointment, all of it mingled together in her expression. He turned to me, and for a long moment he didn't speak. The silence was a living thing, pressing on all of us. Then, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from him, he apologized, not just for the chair or the words, but for every small cruelty, every moment of arrogance and dismissal. He spoke of his own insecurities, of the pressure he'd felt to be more than his father, to be someone Emily could show off to the world. He confessed that he'd been jealous, not just of my history with Richard, but of the bond between me and Emily, a connection he couldn't replicate or buy. The guests were quiet, some looking away, some meeting my eyes with new respect. Tyler's confession wasn't polished or dramatic. It was raw, full of ugly truths and broken pieces. He asked for forgiveness, not as a demand but as a plea, promising to do the work to become someone worthy, not just of Emily, but of the family he was trying to join. There was a part of me that wanted to stay silent, to let the discomfort linger, to make him sweat as I had sweated under his judgment. But as I looked at Emily, her hand in mine, her tears streaking her makeup, I remembered what Jane would have wanted. Mercy, but not at the cost of honesty. I stood, letting the weight of my years show in the way I straightened my back, and I said that forgiveness was not a blank check. It was a commitment, that if Tyler wanted a second chance, he'd have to earn it. Not through words tonight, but through 1,000 small actions in the days to come. Richard nodded, the old soldier in him approving, and dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, her composure finally cracking. Emily let out a shaky breath, hope flickering through her sadness. For a heartbeat, I saw her as she had been at 5, clutching my hand in a crowded room, trusting that I would always keep her safe. The rest of the night moved in fits and starts. Conversations resumed, a little more honest now, the surface tension broken. Some guests offered quiet words of apology, or respect, or simply shook my hand, as if contact could transfer a bit of what I'd carried all these years. I accepted their gestures, knowing that forgiveness, like respect, was a currency that only grew in value the more it was given away. Emily and Tyler sat together, heads close, speaking in low voices. I saw her touch his face, searching for sincerity. Whether he could change, whether he truly understood what had been given and what had been lost, was a question only time could answer. Richard pulled me aside before the end, offering thanks, but also asking what came next. He wanted to know if I could trust his son, if our families could truly be joined after so much pain. I told him the truth, that I didn't know, that all I could do was try, the way I'd tried every day since Jane died, to build something lasting out of broken parts. As the last guests drifted away, I stood on the terrace, looking out at the dark rows of vines, feeling the cool night settle on my skin. Emily joined me, slipping her arm through mine. We didn't need words. The silence was enough, a promise that whatever happened next, we would face it together. The night ended not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet return to the ordinary. Dishes were cleared, music faded, laughter echoed in the empty space. But something had shifted, something real and lasting. A new beginning born out of pain and forgiveness. I wondered if Jane would be proud, if she would see in Emily, and maybe even in Tyler, the same stubborn hope that had kept us going through the worst years. I wanted to believe she would. And as we left the vineyard, the stars bright above us, I felt the threads of the past loosen just enough to let a little light through. Maybe that was all any of us could ask for. A chance to start over, to be seen for who we really are, and to choose again and again to love in spite of everything. The night didn't end with an apology, nor with a neat resolution you'd expect from the movies. Instead, it spilled into something raw, unpredictable, and deeply human. The fragile peace of the vineyard was pierced by the lingering aftermath of confession and forgiveness. The quiet clink of dishes cleared away, the hush that fell over a crowd unsure how to return to celebration after witnessing something so exposed. For a while, I wandered the edge of the terrace, half in shadow, letting the cool air steady me. I saw Tyler standing alone by the trellis, shoulders squared, but I sensed the tremor in him, the way shame and hope can churn in a man's chest, fighting for space. Richard joined me briefly, his voice low, almost reverent. There was relief in his eyes, pride tangled with regret, and an unspoken request for understanding that went deeper than words. He spoke of what it means to be a father, to want so much for your child that you sometimes lose sight of what matters. As he drifted away, I watched the torchlight glimmer on the rings Emily and Tyler now wore, and wondered if those circles would hold them together or prove just another test of what they believed about each other. Inside, Emily moved with grace, her laughter soft but true as she accepted hugs from old friends and family, her cheeks still streaked faintly with the remnants of tears. I knew the courage it took to stand beside Tyler in that storm, to risk her own heart on the promise that people can change. Her mother had that same faith in people, the same stubborn conviction that forgiveness was possible, even when the rest of the world insisted otherwise. I let myself believe for a moment that maybe she was right. Eventually, the crowd began to thin. Some guests slipped away quietly, offering brief congratulations or lingering handshakes that felt heavier than they should. The music softened, shifting to something slow and mournful, and found me near the edge of the dance floor, her eyes rimmed with red, her poise gone. She thanked me for saving Richard, for giving her family a future, for showing them that strength isn't always loud or visible. She said she envied the bond Emily and I shared, the way we never had to pretend. When the last of the formalities ended, I found myself at the edge of a new kind of quiet, the kind that falls after the world turns upside down. Tyler approached, not as the man who had performed confidence all night, but as someone stripped bare, carrying the weight of his own failings. His voice, when it came, was hesitant, uncertain, full of the cracks that make a confession real. He spoke of wanting to be the man Emily deserved, but fearing he was only ever pretending. He said that watching me with her, seeing the trust that passed between us even when we were silent, had shown him everything he lacked. He asked, without demanding, for a second chance, not just with Emily but with me, with Richard, with himself. He admitted that forgiveness felt impossible, but that he was willing to work for it, to learn the lessons life had been trying to teach him the hard way. He said he'd been afraid for so long, afraid of failing, of not being enough, of being measured and found wanting, of living forever in the shadow of men whose courage he could not match. He promised to try, not just for a night, but every day, to be worthy of the family he had almost lost. There was a gravity to his words, an absence of performance, and I found myself remembering all the times I'd stood where he was, wishing for another chance, knowing that redemption comes not in grand gestures but in small daily acts. I told him that respect was earned, that Emily's love was not a prize but a partnership, that he would have to prove himself, not to me, but to the woman who had chosen him in spite of everything. Tyler nodded, shoulders slumping in relief and exhaustion. Emily joined us, her hands slipping into his, her eyes searching his face for honesty. She spoke softly, telling him that love is a decision made over and over, not something sealed by a single vow. She said she believed in his capacity to grow, but would not excuse cruelty or forget what had been said. She asked for patience, for transparency, for humility. In that moment, the three of us stood in a kind of truce, a fragile alliance built on honesty, trembling but real. Later, Richard gathered us together, the four of us sitting beneath the stars with only the flicker of citronella candles for company. He told stories from the war, stories he'd never shared before, stories of fear and failure, and the moments when hope is found only in the kindness of others. And joined in, her voice adding the warmth of family history, memories of building a marriage through hardship and forgiveness, of raising Tyler with expectations and love in equal measure. I told my own stories about Jane, about raising Emily alone, about the loneliness and pride that come with sacrifice. There was laughter, tears, and something close to peace. The night grew cooler. Emily wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, her face lit by the glow of the candles and the gentle pride of a daughter who had witnessed the best and worst of the people she loved. She asked Tyler if he would join her back in Sacramento for a few weeks after the honeymoon, to see the world as she had known it, the rhythms of ordinary life, The taste of coffee brewed in an old pot, mornings spent fixing things that matter to no one but the people who use them. She wanted to bring him home, not just as her husband but as someone willing to belong. Tyler agreed, the promise in his eyes stronger than any spoken word. It was not an ending but a beginning, a chance to build trust from the foundation up, brick by brick, morning by morning. Emily turned to me, her hand on my arm, and thanked me. Not just for the day, but for every day, for every decision that had led us here. She told me that love, in the end, is measured by the courage to forgive and the willingness to keep trying, no matter how many times we fail each other. As the last lights flickered out and the vineyard returned to darkness, I felt the tension in my chest loosen, just a little. There was no guarantee that things would be easy, no promise that pain would not return. But there was hope, the stubborn, unkillable hope that people can change, that wounds can heal, that families, once broken, can be made whole again. I thought of Jane, of the nights we'd spent dreaming of a future that had rarely gone as planned, and I knew she would have approved, not of the pain, but of the willingness to mend what could be mended. The following morning, as dawn touched the vines with silver, I found myself alone with Emily. We walked together in silence, the air crisp, the world quiet. She squeezed my hand, and for a moment, it was as if she were 5 years old again, certain that her father could fix anything. I knew now that she didn't need me to fix her life, only to stand by her as she made her own repairs. That was enough. In the weeks that followed, Emily and Tyler came to Sacramento. They worked beside me in the garage, learned the rhythm of the neighborhood, ate dinners with old friends who measured a man by his word, not his wallet. Tyler listened more than he spoke, asked questions, learned to change oil and patch a tire. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a start. A way forward, a way home. Spring in Sacramento settled quietly that year, slipping in with rain that cleaned the streets and sunlight that coaxed green from every stubborn branch. My old house was never so full, laughter echoing down the hallway, shoes piled at the door, the scent of fresh coffee and bread swirling through the kitchen before dawn. Emily and Tyler stayed longer than planned. Each day seemed to peel away another layer of the wedding's wounds, exposing something tender but healing beneath. I watched as Emily reclaimed pieces of herself I feared had been lost to city lights and ambition. Her hair twisted up as she worked beside me under a car, her smile blooming with the old reckless joy of youth. Tyler changed too, though in smaller, quieter ways. He learned to listen, not just to the hum of engines, but to stories shared over dinner, the cadence of the neighborhood, the unsaid things between father and daughter. It was in those weeks that forgiveness moved from being an idea to something living. I saw it in the way Tyler fixed a neighbor's flat tire without being asked, in the nights he stayed up late, helping Emily with ledgers for a local charity, asking about Jane, about the years before he arrived. I watched him bite back pride, watched him admit when he was wrong, watched him falter and then pick himself up, determined to try again. There was no announcement, no moment of triumph, just a slow, stubborn growth, like the garden Jane once tended, the same stubborn hope pressing up through soil no one thought could bloom. One evening, as dusk painted gold across the backyard, I found Emily and Tyler sitting on the porch steps, knees brushing, hands tangled, voices low. Emily laughed, and the sound was so familiar, so achingly sweet, that for a heartbeat I thought I saw Jane's shadow beside her. They talked about the future, not in grand, sweeping terms, but in the small, honest details that build a life. Tyler wondered aloud if he was truly ready for a family, if he'd ever live up to the love he'd been given. Emily told him that being ready was less about certainty and more about showing up, day after day, for the people who matter. Later, inside, Tyler found me in the kitchen, staring at a photograph of Jane. He asked what it meant to really stay, when it was easier to run from pain or failure. I told him the truth as best I could. I said that love isn't proven in the easy seasons. It's the choice to return, to fix what's broken, to hold tight to the hard days and trust that forgiveness is something you earn by never giving up. He listened, and for the first time I believed he understood. News of the wedding, and all that followed, traveled through the neighborhood in that slow, winding way only small towns have. Neighbors came by with casseroles, offers to help in the yard, stories about Jane I'd never heard. The old men at the diner slapped Tyler on the back, called him son with an approving nod. Emily spent long afternoons with the kids at the community center, her hands covered in paint and glue, her laughter spilling out the windows like sunlight. I could see her choosing, moment by moment, not to let the past poison what came next. But the shadow of the wedding never quite faded. Richard and Anne visited once, standing awkwardly in my kitchen, struggling to fit into a life so different from their own. Richard tried to apologize again, but I stopped him. We both knew some things couldn't be fixed by words, only by showing up, by proving over time that trust, once broken, could be rebuilt. And watched Emily with wonder, then turned to me, asking if I thought things would ever truly be okay. I said I didn't know, but that hope was stubborn. She smiled, a little sad but grateful. One Sunday, the four of us took a drive into the hills. We stopped by the river, where Emily had learned to fish as a girl. The water moved slow and clear, the world gone quiet except for the rush of wind through the trees. Tyler tried to skip stones, each one splashing clumsily. Emily laughed, showing him the trick. Her body relaxed in a way I hadn't seen since before Jane got sick. We sat on the riverbank, talking about nothing, the conversation drifting to the shape of our days, the simple dreams that matter. Dinners shared, friends close, children maybe, one day. I realized, in that gentle hush, that this was what survival looked like. Not triumph, not even happiness, but the gritty, unglamorous choice to keep loving and forgiving even when it's hard. It would be easy to say that everything was perfect after that, but it wasn't. Tyler still struggled sometimes, bristling at the smallest slight, haunted by his failures. Emily had her own doubts about marriage, about forgiveness, about whether it was possible to truly trust after betrayal. I felt old in those moments, worried that all my effort would crumble, that the fragile peace we'd built would snap. But each time, someone stepped up. Emily with a gentle word, Tyler with a silent apology, me with a story about Jane and the stubbornness required to make a life last. The cracks were still there, but we learned to build around them. A year passed. Emily and Tyler found a little house nearby. Tyler started teaching at the local high school, surprising everyone, maybe even himself. Emily began leading the youth art program at the library, her life spilling over into the lives of others. They were not glamorous lives, but they were real. They fought sometimes, they failed sometimes, but the apologies came quicker, the forgiveness easier, the love quieter but stronger. I thought often of Jane, of what she'd say if she could see us. I pictured her in the kitchen, flour dusting her hair, her eyes full of mischief and faith. I wondered if she would have forgiven Tyler as easily as Emily did, or if she would have demanded more proof, more penance. In the end, I decided she'd have done both, loved fiercely, forgiven slowly, and trusted in the hard work of redemption. One autumn night, as the leaves burned gold and red outside, Emily and Tyler came by for dinner. The air was sharp, the house warm. We talked about the past, about how strange and beautiful it was that disaster could make a family stronger. Emily turned to Tyler, gratitude and wonder in her voice, and said she was proud, not just of who he'd become, but of the work he put in every day to stay worthy of her trust. Tyler squeezed her hand, his eyes shining with something that looked a lot like peace. After they left, I sat alone in the kitchen, the house finally quiet. I thought of all that had changed, of pain that had been aired and healed, of wounds that would never quite close but didn't have to fester. I realized that revenge, the dark urge that had once simmered beneath my grief, had given way to something far better. The satisfaction of seeing justice done through mercy, the triumph of love outlasting bitterness. I saw, at last, that the only victory that mattered was the one we earned by refusing to let anger have the final say. In the end, what endured was not the shame of a chair pulled away or the sting of cruel words. What endured was the strength to stand back up, to reach out, to choose love and truth and forgiveness even when it seemed impossible. That was the legacy I wanted for Emily, for Tyler, for whatever family came next. Not a life without scars, but one where scars could become reminders. Not of pain, but of how much we'd overcome together. As I turned off the lights, the old house settling around me, I caught my reflection in the window, older, yes, lined with all the years and losses, but standing. I whispered goodnight to Jane, to hope, to the stubborn, beautiful future I still believed in. And as the first rain of winter tapped gently on the roof, I knew that even in the hardest seasons, love was worth fighting for.